I've been watching this political circus for a long time now, and I'll be honest with you, I thought I'd developed a pretty high tolerance for absurdity. I thought I'd seen just about every possible distortion of diplomacy, every rhetorical stunt, every strongman bluff dressed up as policy. But every so often, something happens that still manages to stop me in my tracks. Not because it's shocking in a tabloid sense, but because it reveals just how far we've drifted from anything resembling normal, stable international relations. And that's exactly what this moment between Donald Trump and Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, represents. You probably saw the headlines. You probably heard the surface story. Trump jokes or half jokes are not really jokes at all about Canada becoming the 51st state. Carney pushes back. Commentators frame it as a clash of personalities, a tense meeting, maybe even a bit of theater on the sidelines of a World Cup event that was supposed to be about cooperation and celebration. But if that's all you take away from this, you've missed what actually matters. What happened in that room wasn't about banter. It wasn't about humor. It wasn't even primarily about ego. It was about power, leverage, and whether sovereignty itself is treated as something negotiable in the modern global economy. Let me slow this down and walk through it with you because the details matter. This took place around a gathering that should have symbolized everything positive about North American integration. The United States, Canada, and Mexico are co hosting the next World Cup. That alone is a reminder of how deeply intertwined these countries are economically, culturally, and institutionally. And yet, behind closed doors, the conversation veered sharply away from unity and towards something much darker: tariffs, trade pressure, and a recurring suggestion from the American president that Canada's problems could all go away if it simply stopped existing as an independent country. Now, I want you to really sit with that for a moment. This wasn't said once in passing. It's been raised repeatedly in official settings, and it's been framed not as a threat, but as a kind of twisted offer. The United States imposes tariffs that hurt Canadian industries, disrupt supply chains, and raise costs for workers and consumers on both sides of the border. Then the same president implies that Canada could escape this pressure by accepting absorption. That's not negotiation in any meaningful sense. That's coercion dressed up as pragmatism. And here's where Mark Carney enters the story in a way that fundamentally changes its tone. Carney isn't a career politician trained to smooth things over with vague language and careful hedging. He comes from central banking, from a world where credibility is everything and where words move markets. When he says something, it's meant to be understood literally. So when he looked at Trump and said, Canada is not for sale, that wasn't a soundbite crafted by aides. That was a line drawn with the kind of clarity you only get from someone who understands that ambiguity is weakness in moments like this, is where the deeper economic story begins to surface. Trump's fixation on tariffs and annexation rhetoric isn't random. It's rooted in a transactional worldview where every relationship is reduced to leverage, where power is exercised by creating pain and then offering relief in exchange for submission. That logic might work in a real estate negotiation. Applied to sovereign nations, it becomes dangerous very quickly because once you treat sovereignty as a bargaining chip, you've crossed a line that can't easily be uncrossed. What's striking and frankly revealing is Trump's reaction to Carney's refusal. Instead of lashing out the way he often did with Justin Trudeau, Trump has praised Carney as tough, as competent, as world class. That tells you something important about how this dynamic works. Resistance, when it's calm and unequivocal, commands a different kind of respect than accommodation ever does. But respect doesn't mean alignment, and it certainly doesn't mean the pressure goes away. Carney has already made clear that a quick deal to remove these tariffs isn't coming. He's pushed the issue into the formal review process of the trade agreement that governs North American commerce. That may sound procedural, even boring, but it's a deliberate strategy. It takes the fight out of the realm of arbitrary threats and puts it into a structure with rules, timelines, and constraints. And in doing so, Carney is signaling something crucial. Canada will absorb short-term pain rather than surrender long-term autonomy. If you're wondering why this matters to you, even if you don't live in Canada, here's the uncomfortable truth. When the United States treats its closest ally this way, it sends a message to the entire world. It says that no relationship is safe from coercion, No agreement is durable, and no principle is sacred if it stands in the way of immediate leverage. That erosion of trust doesn't show up overnight. It shows up slowly in higher prices, fragmented supply chains, weakened alliances, and a world that becomes more unstable precisely because power is exercised without restraint. This isn't just a story about Trump and Carney. It's a story about how economic pressure has become a substitute for diplomacy and how leaders who understand systems, not just slogans, are forced to respond. And as we keep going, what I want you to pay attention to is not the drama, but the structure underneath it. Who holds power, how it's used, and who ultimately pays the price when sovereignty itself is treated like a bargaining chip. Now, let's dig into the machinery behind this, because tariffs don't fall from the sky, and they aren't just rhetorical weapons. They are policy tools embedded in a specific economic system, one that rewards disruption. When disruption produces leverage, when Donald Trump talks about tariffs on Canada, he frames them as protection, as strength, as standing up for American workers. But that framing collapses the moment you look at how the North American economy actually functions. Canada is not some distant rival with a separate industrial base. It is woven directly into American production. The steel that crosses the border doesn't magically become foreign in any meaningful economic sense. It becomes a car frame in Michigan, machinery in Ohio, energy infrastructure across the Midwest. When you tax that steel, you're taxing your own supply chain. This is why Carney's refusal to rush into a deal matters so much. He understands something that gets lost in the daily noise of political coverage. Tariffs don't create strength, they create pressure points, and pressure points are not neutral. They hurt workers first, long before they inconvenience executives or politicians. A tariff on aluminum doesn't show up as a line item in a trade ledger for most people. It shows up as higher prices, delayed projects, canceled shifts, and eventually layoffs. It shows up in communities that already feel precarious, where a single plant closure can hollow out an entire town. What Trump is doing and what Carney is pushing back against is the use of economic pain as a negotiating strategy. You inflict enough damage that the other side feels compelled to concede. That may sound abstract, but it has very real consequences. American manufacturers who rely on Canadian inputs see costs rise. Canadian workers in export sectors face uncertainty. Small businesses that operate on thin margins get squeezed from both sides, and all of this is justified under the language of winning. Carney's background matters here in a way that's easy to underestimate. As a central banker, he spent years managing crises where confidence itself was the fragile variable. During financial panics, what leaders say and how clearly they say it can stabilize or destabilize entire economies. That experience shapes how he approaches Trump. He's not trying to flatter, he's not trying to plate, he's establishing a boundary and then letting the system absorb the consequences. That's a fundamentally different posture from one rooted in political optics. And notice something else that's happening at the same time. Trump has publicly praised Carney even as Carney blocks his core demand. That contradiction isn't accidental. Trump responds to strength because strength validates his worldview. But he also expects that strength to be transactional. Praise is extended with the expectation that it will eventually produce compliance. Carney's gamble is that it won't. This is where the broader trade framework becomes critical. The agreement governing trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, often referred to as USMCA, was renegotiated and signed under Trump himself. Now it's being treated as provisional, as something that can be overridden through unilateral tariffs whenever it becomes inconvenient. That should worry you regardless of where you live or what you think about trade policy. Because when agreements are treated as temporary expressions of power rather than binding commitments, planning becomes impossible. Investment slows, supply chains fragment, everyone operates defensively. The meeting that included Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum added another layer to this dynamic. Trump has a long history of trying to divide negotiating partners, hinting that one country might get better treatment if it breaks ranks. The fact that Canada and Mexico were in the room together mattered. It signaled at least the possibility of coordination of resisting being played off against each other. Whether that solidarity holds is an open question, but its importance can't be overstated. Fragmentation is power for the dominant actor. Unity is the only real counterweight. What often goes missing in media coverage is how deliberately this chaos is generated. Tariffs are announced, delayed, escalated, and sometimes reversed with little warning. That uncertainty is not a side effect, it's the point. When businesses can't plan, they become more willing to accept bad deals just to restore predictability. When governments are under constant threat, they're pressured to prioritize short-term relief over long-term resilience. Carney's refusal to provide that relief on Trump's terms is an attempt to break that cycle. And let's be clear about something else. The suggestion that Canada could or should become a U.S. state is not a serious policy proposal. It's a dominance ritual. It's about forcing the other party to respond to an absurd premise, thereby shifting the entire frame of the conversation. If you argue details, you've already lost. Carney didn't argue details. He rejected the premise outright. That matters more than it might seem. As we move forward, the real question isn't whether Trump will keep pushing. He will. The question is whether the economic pain generated by this strategy rebounds politically inside the United States. American workers, consumers, and businesses are not insulated from this. They are deeply exposed to it. And when the costs become undeniable, pressure doesn't flow north, it flows inward toward Washington. This is the long game Carney is playing. Absorb the noise, hold the line, force the system to confront its own contradictions. And whether that works or not will tell us a great deal about how much leverage remains in an era where economic integration and political nationalism are colliding head on. What I want you to see next is how this kind of pressure politics filters down into everyday life in ways that rarely make headlines. Because when we talk about tariffs and trade agreements, the language becomes abstract very quickly. It sounds like something happening far above your head, negotiated by people in suits in rooms you'll never enter. But the consequences don't stay up there. They move down slowly and unevenly until they show up in places that feel very familiar. Think about a manufacturing town that depends on cross-border supply chains, not because of ideology, not because of globalism as a buzzword, but because that's how production evolved over decades. Parts cross the border multiple times before a finished product ever rolls off an assembly line. A tariff inserted into that system doesn't just add a cost. It introduces friction, schedules slip, orders shrink. Managers start talking about uncertainty. Overtime disappears. Then temporary contracts aren't renewed. Then shifts are cut. By the time the news catches up, the damage is already done. This is why the media focus on personalities misses the point. You're invited to watch Trump and Carney as characters in a drama, as if the stakes are about who looks stronger or who lands the sharper line. But the real story is structural. It's about how economic systems respond to instability. Capital hates uncertainty. When rules change unpredictably, investment pulls back. And when investment pulls back, workers pay the price long before executives do. What Carney seems to understand, and what Trump either ignores or exploits, is that this system has momentum. You can't bully it forever without consequences. Tariffs imposed as leverage don't stay neatly contained as negotiating tools. They ripple outward, distorting prices and incentives in ways that are hard to reverse. A company that shifts suppliers to avoid tariffs doesn't automatically shift back when tariffs are lifted. A plant that closes doesn't reopen just because a deal is announced. The scars remain. There's also a deeper political effect at work here, one that's easy to underestimate. When a country feels its sovereignty is being questioned, public opinion hardens. Canadians across the political spectrum have reacted strongly to the idea that their country's independence is up for discussion. That reaction constrains Carney's room to maneuver. Even if he wanted to offer concessions to ease tensions, doing so under the shadow of annexation rhetoric would look like capitulation. In that sense, Trump's strategy backfires. It strengthens resistance rather than weakening it. And this is where class dynamics quietly enter the picture. Trade wars are often sold as fights on behalf of workers, but they are rarely fought on workers' terms. Decisions are made at the top, costs are absorbed at the bottom, and any eventual gains are distributed unevenly. Executives can restructure, investors can diversify. Workers are tied to place to mortgage payments to schools and communities. They don't get to hedge against policy volatility. Carney's long game approach is essentially a bet on this reality. He's betting that sustained economic disruption will generate political pressure inside the United States, pressure from businesses that need stable rules and from workers who feel the pinch at the checkout line and on the job. He's betting that eventually the cost of using tariffs as a cudgel outweighs the benefits of using them as theater. But this is not a risk-free strategy. Canada is the smaller economy. It has less raw leverage. Holding the line requires resilience, and resilience is not evenly distributed. Some sectors can weather prolonged uncertainty better than others. Some communities are better insulated than others. That's the uncomfortable truth beneath the rhetoric of national resolve. Even principled resistance has uneven costs. What's happening here also tells us something unsettling about how power operates in the current phase of global capitalism. Economic integration created enormous efficiencies, but it also created vulnerabilities. Those vulnerabilities can be weaponized, control the choke points, introduce uncertainty, and you gain leverage without ever firing a shot. Tariffs are just one expression of that logic. Sanctions, regulatory threats, supply chain disruptions all operate on the same principle. When Trump suggests Canada could solve its problems by ceasing to exist as a sovereign nation, he's pushing that logic to its extreme. It's not meant to be realistic. It's meant to assert dominance, to remind the other side of asymmetry. Carney's response works precisely because it refuses to internalize that asymmetry. He doesn't argue about feasibility. He doesn't negotiate the insult. He denies the frame entirely. As you watch this unfold, I want you to keep asking yourself a simple question. Who benefits from constant instability and who pays for it? Because once you start asking that, the story stops being about personalities and starts being about power. And that's where the real lesson is hiding. There's another layer to this that we need to talk about, because if we stop at tariffs and diplomacy, we miss the deeper logic that keeps producing these confrontations. What you're watching is not an aberration. It's a feature of an economic system that rewards short-term leverage over long-term stability. When politics is filtered through markets and markets are filtered through power, behavior that looks reckless at the surface often makes perfect sense underneath. In a system driven by capital flows, attention cycles, and quarterly outcomes, disruption can be profitable. Volatility creates opportunities for those positioned to exploit it. Currency traders, hedge funds, large multinationals with flexible supply chains, they all have tools to manage or even benefit from uncertainty. Ordinary workers do not. They experience volatility as insecurity, as anxiety, as the constant sense that the ground beneath them might shift without warning. When tariffs are announced on a whim, the people with the least room to maneuver are always the first to feel it. This is why the fixation on whether Trump personally likes or respects Carney is such a distraction. Personal dynamics matter at the margins, but the real driver here is structural power. The United States has the ability to impose pain because of its size and centrality in the global economy. That power exists regardless of who occupies the White House. Trump simply uses it more openly and more crudely than most. What Carney is confronting is not just a president, but a system that allows economic dominance to be exercised with minimal accountability. And here's the uncomfortable part. The American political system often rewards this behavior. Tariffs can be announced without congressional approval. Economic damage can be framed as toughness. When prices rise, blame can be shifted to foreigners, to global forces, to anyone but the policymaker who pulled the lever. That insulation from consequences encourages repetition. If the costs were immediately and clearly borne by those making the decisions, this strategy would be far less attractive. Carney's refusal to play along exposes that asymmetry. By pushing negotiations into formal review processes and refusing quick fixes, he's trying to force accountability back into the system. He's saying if you want changes, you're going to have to go through rules you agreed to, timelines you can't control, and scrutiny you can't evade. That's not dramatic, it's procedural. And precisely because it's procedural, it's threatening to a style of politics that thrives on improvisation and spectacle. You can also see how this reshapes public understanding of sovereignty. For decades, Economic integration was sold as a win-win, as something that reduced conflict and increased prosperity, and in many ways it did. But it also blurred boundaries. It created the illusion that borders no longer mattered, that power had dissolved into markets. Moments like this remind us that borders still matter very much, especially when one side decides to weaponize interdependence. What's happening now is a reassertion of sovereignty under pressure. Canada is being forced to articulate limits that once went without saying. That alone tells you how degraded the relationship has become. Allies shouldn't have to clarify that they intend to remain countries. The fact that they do is a signal that something fundamental has shifted. This also reframes the question of leadership. Strength in this context isn't about matching threats with threats. It's about resisting the temptation to trade long-term autonomy for short-term relief. That's a difficult position to hold, especially when the pain is real and unevenly distributed. It requires political capital, public trust, and a willingness to absorb criticism. Carney is drawing on his credibility to do that. Whether it lasts will depend on how long the pressure continues and how resilient the underlying economy proves to be. And this brings us back to you because it's easy to watch this as a distant geopolitical story. But the logic at work here shows up everywhere. Employers using uncertainty to extract concessions. Governments invoking crisis to justify concentration of power. Markets rewarding those who can move fast and punishing those who can't move at all. Once you recognize the pattern, you start seeing it repeat. So, as this standoff continues, don't just watch the headlines. Watch who is asked to be patient and who is insulated from the consequences. Watch how quickly principles are invoked and how slowly they are defended. And ask yourself whether a system that treats instability as a tool can ever really deliver the security it promises.